Wait, hold on. Here's a reply for Herm.
I started developing a list of peer-reviewed research around invasive species and restoration in general, and really started to think about writing this book and how I felt like it was necessary to address the field of ecosystem restoration from a more organic, holistic perspective. And so I wanted to just share a little bit about my background as I came into this world of ecosystem restoration. And, you know, as I delved into the science of invasion ecology and really looking into what, you know, what are the concerns around invasive species, where did this kind of idea come from, or the, you know, what were the observations that people are having about invasive species? Because of course I was familiar with them, you know, as a gardener and just somebody interested in ecology, but I didn't know the extent to which they were considered so threatening. And so I kind of peeled back through the literature of invasion ecology and found that there was kind of this seminal study in 1991, Princeton University attempted to quantify the threats to global biodiversity and, you know, kind of codified this list and found in that study that invasive species are the second greatest threat. And this little piece of information has been repeated in subsequent invasion ecology literature over 3,500 times. So it's been cited again and again and again. And pretty much every article that you read about invasive species will cite this paper. So, you know, you hear this kind of over and over, second greatest threat, second greatest threat. And I found that to be quite interesting, for one, because it's not the first greatest threat that's repeated over and over and over again, which that study found that the first greatest threat was habitat destruction, which is probably doesn't come as a surprise to very many people. I also found it interesting that habitat destruction and some of the other threats that were identified by this study weren't linked to species invasions. And I feel like that was an oversight of the kind of more linear approach to understanding some of these complex ecological issues in an attempt to kind of silo them apart or separate them out one from another. And I think that it's important in this kind of taking this holistic perspective that we start to see the linkages between some of the design systems that we have out in the world, the way that we produce food, the way that we access timber, the way that we control water for floods and irrigation. All of these things are linked to species invasions, and we can kind of track that back. And if we start to understand how these processes and influences are related to invasive species, I think that we can start to make better management choices when it comes to looking at true ecosystem restoration. So one of the things that happened because of this concept of threat in the field of ecological restoration is that herbicide use became kind of this primary way that many land managers approach the issue of invasive species. And you see it kind of all over very diverse ecosystems, from aquatic ecosystems to riparian ecosystems, forested ecosystems. There's kind of this ideology of war, which is in a lot of ways, in my opinion, similar to conventional agriculture, right? So you have this idea of pests, which, you know, is basically something that is not in line with your particular outcome a lot of times, which is, you know, economic. And you're not necessarily looking at the underlying reason why maybe your plants are stressed and more prone to herbivory by insects that like to eat them. And when you start to kind of shift that perspective and look at the influence of soil health or drought stress or particular upstream changes in hydrological dynamics that might be affecting what you're seeing on the ground, you can kind of start to shift that narrative a little bit. And so I think that this calls into question for me this idea of harm and what we're really talking about when we hear these words like threat and harm. How are we really conceiving of that on a small scale? Like in the background of this slide here, this is Spartina, which is an invasive species. It's a pretty big concern in Washington State, the estuaries, and it's considered kind of one of the #1 invasive species in this ecosystem. But for many people who wouldn't, the untrained eye, right, would look at that and say, oh, that's so beautiful. However, in the kind of invasion ecology literature, this is considered a harmful species. And there's reasons for that. And, I do cover Spartina in depth in one chapter in my book because I find it such an interesting example. But one of the things about the definition of invasive species and kind of that gets to kind of the central issue around invasion ecology as a science is the definition of this idea isn't, in my opinion, a kind of objectively definable thing. It's not like gravity, that could be tested, and no matter where you are on the surface of the earth, at least, you're going to experience it the same way again and again. There's equations that you can come up with, and it's objectively verifiable no matter what. When it comes to invasive species, the definition is rather subjective. And when the National Invasive Species Council, which in the US is kind of the federal level agency that is charged with kind of coming up with policy around species invasions and what to do about them, they deliberated actually for years around how to define an invasive species because it's so malleable. It's, no species is invasive everywhere. Why is that? Is, an important question, kind of looking at that subjectivity. But when they finally settled on a definition, it's an 11-page document. It's a, kind of, it's not just a sentence or a paragraph, it's a long, qualified statement about what an invasive species is or is not. One of the central features is the idea of harm. And for me, when I kind of take this bigger picture perspective at looking at what's going on when I see an invasive species, there's a lot of things that are going on in the world that I think we should be looking at when it comes to harm, ecological harm in particular. And just as an example, in the United States, these numbers are from the United States alone, this isn't worldwide, nearly 300 million acres of land are tilled, sprayed for the most part. This is mostly conventional management to grow 3 crops in monoculture fields. Now, 300 million acres is by leaps and bounds more acreage that is covered by every invasive species on the continent. And yet, this agriculture is considered our economy, right? It's considered this one of the fundamental economic drivers of our country. And invasive species are considered threats to ecosystems. So I think that we really need to kind of go higher up the ladder, if you will, of investigating what the cause of ecosystem degradation. And, you know, hearkening back to that Princeton University study, the first greatest threat to global biodiversity is habitat destruction. And so one of my kind of conversations with restoration ecologists and people interested in conservation in the years since I've wrote this book is, should we be focusing our attention on these kind of higher order harms? Because this is where we're losing biodiversity all over the world, minute by minute, and we're, you know, it's happening year after year. These 300 million acres and 3 crops was once, you know, tall grass prairie and oak savanna and riparian hardwood forest and wetland. We need to be working in those contexts, in my opinion, to really ramp up the scale of ecological restoration and biodiversity enhancement that we need to be engaged in. That's where I'm interested in kind of focusing attention when it comes to ecosystem restoration. So I think it's important, as we kind of delve into this bigger picture perspective, to look at what we consider normal and what we consider bad for the environment. So let me see if I can, oops, sorry. Trying to get this pointer thing to work over here. Maybe that's not going to work. But if you look at, in the upper right-hand corner, we see a very familiar face there. That's Scotch broom growing on the roadside. And, you know, I've had experiences with several people, friends, you know, who I've been out on trips with and things like that, remarking on how much they hate Scotch broom and how it's so ugly and how they just wish they could, you know, jump out of the car and just pull it all out. And I always find it interesting because, you know, I don't feel like I hear those same sentiments when we're like driving by the pulp mill outside of Springfield, or, you know, to see a feedlot like that, or a suburban kind of development that has obviously impacted some kind of ecosystem. And, you know, I think that these connection points and our perspective shift are also necessary. And looking even in this picture of Scotch broom, it's evident that, to me, at least to my eye, that something happened in that ecosystem. In this case, it was likely the process of the road being constructed that facilitated the invasion, created the conditions in which Scotch broom thrives. And it's not necessarily the invasive species are a symptom, if you want to think of it in those terms. They're the end result. They're not the primary actor in many, many cases. So one of the things that I kind of looked at as part of my research was systems thinking and systems science. And this is called the iceberg model of systems thinking here in this slide. And basically what it's referring to is that the event or the thing that you see out in the world is literally just the tip of the iceberg. And it's underlined by all of these other pieces of reality, including the mental model, the structures and kind of physical forces at play, and these longer term trends that lead to the observable phenomenon that you're kind of interacting with in the moment. And so this has been helpful for me because, you know, it's interesting, at the base is transforming that mental model, that perception again of what you're seeing as being good or bad. You know, I kind of try to move beyond that and think about more in terms of, I kind of call it forensic ecology. Like if I see an ecosystem where there's a lot of invasive species, I think, what happened here? What's the history of this site? And, you know, how can I kind of unpeel the layers of the onion of which, you know, the invasive species are the thing that I'm seeing now, but there's a story behind that. And so I've shifted my mental model to be able to see things in a different way. And that helps inform a different approach to managing them as well. Because I'm not necessarily, in most cases, an advocate of just letting them be. You know, I think that in some cases, that's probably what, you know, just given current context, what will happen. But I think there's a lot of things that we can do with any species invasion where people are concerned about it to address it in a way that contributes to the real regeneration of that ecosystem. Just have to be creative about it. This is an example that I looked into pretty thoroughly in my book, which is the example of salt cedar or tamarisk. And this, you can kind of see it in the lower right-hand side, that green shrub growing along the banks there of the Colorado River. It's a much maligned invasive species on many riparian corridors in the southwestern United States. Largely because the kind of conventional framework is it outcompetes, it grows so fast that it outcompetes native riparian vegetation like cottonwoods and willows, which then leads to higher water temperatures because there's less shade going onto the water. And so there are large-scale eradication efforts for salt cedar. And I found this really interesting study that came out in 2014, so relatively recent. My book came out in 2015, so at the time it was kind of like the newest research about tamarisk, where a researcher from the University of Arizona went out to the one undammed river in the southwestern United States, thinking that there was some kind of relationship between the dams and the changed hydrological dynamics of the riparian corridor and salt cedar. She went up to this river without any dams on it. And she looked at the vegetation. And what she found was that there was tamarisk or salt cedar growing there. It wasn't absent, but native cottonwoods and willows were the dominant canopy species. And what she hypothesized was that because this river was able to have its natural flooding cycles where the sediments were washed down, the gravels roll around, the willow and cottonwood seeds get that scraping that they need to germinate, and they thrive. And so she actually worked, she, formed the hypothesis. So this is like, science in action. And then designed the experiment was to work with dam operators on the Rio Grande River to simulate historic seasonal pulses of floodwaters through this one stretch between two dams along the river. And so rather than doing the timed releases that they do mostly for irrigation, they did, they tried to mirror what historic flood waters would have looked like. And what did they find downstream the next season was a huge germination of native willow and cottonwood seedlings, and the salt cedar started to die because salt cedar doesn't like to be flooded. So this study, really pointed out to me and, to, I think, the researcher, and I'm hoping that it's kind of starting to shift the narrative for this particular species, because it shows so clearly that our kind of design choices, again, the way that we've constrained ecosystems into these certain narrow ways of being, in the case of the Colorado and other rivers being dammed for irrigation, hydropower, etc., they're highly regulated riparian areas or waterways, which really affects the riparian area. And so the salt cedar is a result of that. And the salt cedar is thriving in the conditions that we've created. And if we don't want salt cedar and we'd rather have native willow and cottonwood, which I think everybody agrees that would be great, then we need to manage the water differently, because none of these approaches that you see here on this slide are going to address that root issue of a lack of recruitment of native willows and cottonwoods due to a lack of, historical flood regimes. And, this brings up some hard questions. We're not necessarily just going to be like, oh, well, we don't need those dams anyway. It's not as easy as that, but it really, I think, should bring us to those bigger picture questions about, well, what interests are being served by that? What kinds of decentralized agriculture, power generation systems could we create in these environments that are now being serviced by these big projects that are obviously not serving ecological outcomes that we're saying that we want? Those are some exciting conversations. And I think more and more, especially in light of what's happening now, communities all over are having these exact kinds of conversations. Like, how do we want to redesign the systems of our livelihood so that they really are nurturing to us and to the ecosystems in which we live? That's the exciting work of the future. One of the interesting kind of veins of study that I got into in thinking about this concept was the idea of invasion itself, because I was kind of thinking about, oh, maybe I should propose that we use a new term like opportunistic organisms or things like that. But the more I read from the field of evolutionary biology, the more that I realized that in that kind of branch of science, invasion is talked about as like this normal thing, and it's not this kind of loaded term. In fact, it's considered a part of the evolution, the driving force of evolution. So I found that interesting, again, kind of highlighting that subjectivity in the science of invasion ecology, because in this other branch of science, another branch of biology, people are pretty acceptant of the fact that invasion is a part of the way things happen on the planet. And I found this really interesting example. Kind of in the background there, you see the profile of these finches. So these are actually the 14 species of finch that Darwin found and, described when he traveled to the Galapagos Islands. And for those of you who are familiar with this story, this was what kind of really crystallized his conception of the theory of natural selection, because what he found was that finches on different islands had different beak shapes because he saw them exploiting different food resources. Some of them ate insects, some of them ate seeds, some of them ate fruit. And so his hypothesis was that these 14 species had all come from an original ancestor, and that over time, through natural selection, they had speciated, they had diversified. And so in this case, biodiversity increased through speciation, through natural selection. And so that was like the thing that, drove Darwin to his theory. And so more recently, researchers have been like, oh, well, now that we have DNA, ways of like looking at DNA, let's actually see if Darwin was right. Did they come from an original ancestor? And so they did just that. They mapped the DNA, the genome of these finches. And what they found was that indeed they did come from an original ancestor. And interestingly, this original ancestor was an invasive species. It had come from the cloud forests of Venezuela 2.3 million years ago, at a time when the Isthmus of Panama was not connected to South America. So there was a different current, oceanic currents there, and they actually were likely blown there in a storm. And they kind of set up shop and spread to the different islands. 2.3 million years later, there are 14 different species, and biodiversity increased through that invasion. So again, this is a long time frame, but I find this a very interesting example, because we should be thinking in terms of how natural selection works, and kind of understanding that process is constant. It doesn't end with invasion, and in fact, invasion is continuing to drive that process in really interesting ways. One of the things that often is brought up about a concern related to invasive species is the idea that they lack their natural checks and balances that they had in their place of origin. So this would be predators, diseases, things that would help to keep their population in check. And that's definitely true. In many cases, when something comes from somewhere far away and shows up, it's going to have a population spike, more or less, until natural selection continues and acts and helps to bring that population down a bit. This example is a really interesting picture of that. On the left here, that is a cane toad, which is highly, well, it was maybe lowly regarded invasive species in Australia. It was imported to Australia in the 1910s as a hopeful biological control agent for cane beetles. So sugarcane plantations, which were also imported. So again, looking at that big picture context of land use change is important here. There were beetles there that were eating the cane. And so these cane toads, which are from the Caribbean, were brought over because they were used for biological control in sugarcane in the Caribbean. But it turned out that the species of beetle that lived in Australia lived too high up in the sugarcane for the toad to jump. And so they weren't able to control the cane beetles. And cane toads contain this toxic alkaloid in their skin. And so anything that tried to eat them would die. And so this was kind of the perfect storm of contexts in which this species of toad their population just exploded. And they're omnivorous, so they eat both plants and animals, and they definitely, as their population grew, they definitely, changed the ecosystems where they were found. And they actually made like a kind of campy horror movie about cane toads. I don't know if anybody's seen it, but it's pretty funny. But their populations had a big spike over the last several decades. However, just in the past 10 years or so, researchers have been finding that the little lizard-like thing on the right It's a native Australian blue-tongued skink. They feed on this plant here in the middle, which is another invasive species in Australia, called a plant species called Mother of Millions. So the skink is also omnivorous. It eats both plants and animals. Over the generations, it's been feeding on this introduced plant. This plant just happens to contain a very similar alkaloid to what the toad's skin contains, but in a smaller concentration. So the skinks have been able to feed on that plant. Over the generations, they build up a tolerance to that alkaloid. Then they start eating the king toads. And a predator emerges after about 85 years post-invasion. There's a predator. So I find this really fascinating because, you know, it's kind of like, what are the chances that this plant would have the same alkaloid as that toad? And, you know, it just seems, it's just interesting to think about, but it also brings up a kind of larger idea that there will always be something that emerges that will try to eat you. And, or, you know, this idea of checks and balances is always in play. Whether or not we can see it at the time is another question, but it's with invasive species, you know, we should definitely be aware that the ecosystem is acting. There's ecological actors moving in the direction of achieving some type of homeostasis or kind of dynamic equilibrium at all times. And another factor that we really need to be thinking about with invasive species is climate change. And there's a lot of really interesting research going on about and modeling with how ecosystems are likely to change given various climate parameters. And one piece of research that from this area, the US Forest Service looked at how plant communities would change given a 2°C rise, which is kind of on the low end of what we're anticipated to be living with in the next 50 years or so. They predicted, based on that and kind of looking at changes in snowpack and rainfall and increases of temperature, that novel plant communities, like completely unknown plant assemblages, would occupy nearly 50% of land area in the Western United States by the end of this century. So they were able to kind of map out areas that like the Oregon white oak would thrive and the ponderosa pine would thrive and the Western red cedar, and kind of looked at, you know, their climatic characteristics that they like and see where those might end up. But 50% of the land area didn't have plants that are currently native to here that matched with any of those spaces. So that's a big deal. And, you know, I think that we really, it's hard to even conceptualize what that is going to mean. But we can we're already starting to see some of that playing out here. I know that there's been some research recently coming out of Oregon State looking at the die-off of the Douglas fir and predicting that it's likely that the Douglas fir is not going to be viable in the Willamette Valley floor by 2050. And, you know, that's a huge consideration. So what is going to be viable there? There's also research from more the field of kind of future biology, I would say, like more evolutionary biology, predicting that earlier successional species, so species that kind of thrive in more disturbed environments, are actually going to do better in the type of conditions that climate change is bringing to the planet. So, and it's interesting to note that many invasive species are early successional species. They're not like the climax species that you have in kind of your more stable, longer lived ecosystems. That's also important. I saw an interesting study from OSU, actually, I think it was from 2013, that actually looked at the Himalayan blackberry growth versus the growth of the native blackberry in a lab kind of simulated environment, where as the CO2 was dialed up, they found that the Himalayan blackberry grew 4 times faster than the native blackberry, which I'm sure for any of us who live in Western Oregon, we know that is a very familiar factor, is that the Himalayan blackberries just grow like incredibly. And, you know, if we can kind of relate that back to the fact that they're actually doing better in a high CO2 environment, we're selecting for that from a natural selection perspective. And, you know, I think we really need to, again, kind of take that more objective standpoint. Like there's a big experiment going on right now ecologically, and we really need to be thinking about how we can be strategic about preserving and enhancing biodiversity and helping things move to where they're going to survive. I mean, this whole conversation about assisted migration of plant and animal communities is a huge one in the conservation field right now. And I think that, you know, there's no definitive answers. Like, many academics are on one side saying we need to do it. Others are saying, no, we can't do it, you know, largely because of the fear of invasive species. And I'm kind of hopeful that, you know, that'll start to shift as we realize the necessity of taking action, you know, on our part to do something to help with this situation. This is an interesting example. We are starting to see species moving already. Maybe some of you have read some of the research about, there's been quite a bit done on birds moving slowly up in elevation to find their ideal habitat that has the kind of temperature range that they prefer for their growth and mating and nest building and stuff like that. But eventually, you know, as the temperature continues to rise, there will become, you know, they're going to reach the top of the mountain, right? There's no more habitat left unless you start moving poleward. And, you know, I think we're starting to see some of that as well. So this is an interesting example of the California yellow lupin, which is endemic to Sonoma County, which is just north of San Francisco, on a very kind of narrow strip of sand dune type ecosystem. In Humboldt County, which is just about 200 miles north, it's considered an invasive species in those dunes. And I've had some interesting conversations with restoration folks in that area about this exact question. You know, are we seeing the northward advancement of this species? And should we be kind of thinking adaptively about the ecosystem functions that this plant is serving, especially for pollinators, for, you know, dune stabilization, things like that. All of the things that it's lauded for in Sonoma County, you know, we can also consider that in Humboldt County. It's not that far away. So yeah, that's just another interesting example of that. And then we come to, when you see ecosystems or just pieces of land where it's obvious that invasive species have completely displaced native species. So you've all probably heard of kudzu, the vine that ate the South. And here's an example where you see it completely covering what was once a forest. And so again, I like to kind of take this longer term and bigger picture perspective on situations like this. First, to understand that in this case of kudzu, actually, the Natural Resource Conservation Service actually paid farmers to plant kudzu just before the dawn of the so-called Green Revolution, because the soils were completely collapsing in the 20s and 30s in the US South due to decades of poor farming practices. And kudzu is a really rapidly growing nitrogen fixing vine. And so the thought was that they could stabilize soils, especially in riparian areas, and keep the rivers from collapsing as well. You know, they were kind of concerned about like full-scale ecological collapse brought on by poor agricultural practices. And what we see today with kudzu is kind of a remnant of that. The agricultural practices haven't changed that much, but we discovered, you know, some practices and the chemical techniques that have kind of characterized agriculture since then, but we're left with, you know, the kudzu. And it is going to take some creative management to bring this system into more of a biodiverse ecosystem. Another consideration for native ecosystems and why they may not be thriving as robustly as we may like has to do with the concept of wilderness and wildness in general. And this is something that I delve into quite a bit in my book and have kind of focused on a lot in my more recent work. And I feel like this kind of underpins a lot of the kind of conventional conservation framework, the idea that landscapes were pristine and uninhabited kind of plays into this idea that invasive species are taking over and messing them up. When really the bigger story is that landscapes were managed by indigenous people in very particular ways all throughout the world. And colonial interests, in most cases, didn't appreciate the level of sophistication that those agricultural systems embodied. And by displacing them, they opened up the ecosystem to change in any number of ways. And we are living with the results of that. In this area, you know, many of you are probably familiar with the fact that the Willamette Valley was largely characterized by an oak savanna type ecosystem, oaks being the main carbohydrate, protein, perennial food staple crop in the form of acorns. They were cultivated, and the cultivation strategy was largely through periodic burning. And the burning also encouraged the growth of new grasses for forage for deer and elk, which were also a really important food species. They also stimulated the reproduction of camas and other lily bulbs, which are important native food crops. And indigenous burning was made illegal in Oregon in 1859, so a year after Oregon achieved statehood. And taking that away and the displacement of the people and the forced relocation of many of them to reservations at Grand Ronde and Siletz, had devastating consequences culturally and just personally for the people who lived here and whose land it was. From an ecological perspective, it also kind of opened up the system, which had been very carefully managed, to a wide array of species coming in and taking root. And, to my eye, like pretty much everywhere I look, it's just abundantly clear that we are lacking in that consistent fire-based ecology and management of these systems with a kind of focus on periodic mild disturbance, which would set succession back to a more kind of open canopy forb and grass dominated system instead of a shrub and tree dominated ecosystem. I know we didn't really talk that much about succession in this session, but that's an important feature of this kind of framework as well. So one of the things that I always kind of ask people when they say, well, what do I do about X invasive species? My question is, what are the native species that you're wanting to have present there? And how can we facilitate them? Because kind of turning that question around and realizing, appreciating the fact that these native species in most every case are species in need of some kind of cultural intervention to thrive. They're not just failing to thrive because invasive species are bad. They're failing to thrive because their ecological context has been completely taken away. And this book here on the left, Tending the Wild, has been incredibly foundational for me in my own work. Kat Anderson is the lead ethnoecologist at the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And there's a few other researchers who have kind of brought a lot of this information to light. Another one is Nancy Turner from the University of Victoria, who's written several books, The Earth's Blanket, Keeping It Living. Basically what the evidence shows time after time after time is that these native species rely on human influence to spread, to regenerate, to form propagative material, to bring the thatch down so they can actually bloom and get pollinated. And so I would say, kind of the leading edge of restoration is starting to delve more into how we can adapt some of these practices to our current context. We're not necessarily going to be able to do wide scale burning. It might not be appropriate anymore, but it is in certain cases. So I know some places like the Long Tom Watershed Council has been really forward thinking in adapting some of these practices to our modern context. So that is really heartening. Like to see more of that all over the place. So yeah, my basic kind of fundamental approach to this is that when we're thinking about managing invasive species, and we should kind of recharacterize the problem, the so-called problem, really think about why they're there in the first place. Can we kind of look back at the history of a given landscape and understand what they're doing there? And then how can we kind of be forward thinking to really think about what we're restoring to? Because that's a big kind of question in restoration as well, and highlighting that subjectivity again. A lot of people, there's this idea that some time in the past was the good time, right? That there was like this glowing year, you know, the 1750 was like, is the reference year for when everything was right. And that's, if we can just get back to that, you know, it'll be okay. And I find that really interesting, just given all of the scope of the massive changes that have gone on in our social economic development on this landscape over the past 250 years. We're not in 1750 right now. We really need to be thinking about how we can accomplish these goals of biodiversity enhancement given all of these challenges that we're facing right now. And so I really think of this as like thinking about restoration from a much deeper perspective. And so when I work with folks to develop invasive species plans, this is kind of a framework for how I address that issue. Looking at history, soil and water, concerns, qualities, changes, impoundments, you know, were beaver trapped out of the valley? Like there's all of these questions that we can come up with. Also looking at the functional characteristics of the invasive species that we're looking at, like what's going on with them? What ecological role are they filling in this time and place? And one of the things I like to really focus on is what is the goal? What are we really going for? The goal shouldn't be remove all invasive species. The goal should really be a lot more kind of robust and multifaceted. Like we would like this to be an intact oak savanna ecosystem, or we would like this to be a closed canopy conifer forest with a diverse understory. Those are two very different ecosystems. They will have two very different management approaches. And so we need to decide on that as a goal and make the plan based on that. And so it's just a little brief about that. And I just like to think about how the practice of restoration should really be nested in all of the other aspects of our livelihood. And one of my interests as a permaculture person is really how can we, in our own gardens and our own home sites, really layer in this biodiversity enhancement goal with our own kind of more localized food production. So I really am thinking about habitat enhancement. I monitor all different kinds of native species on my property. I work to enhance them over time. I'm also growing a lot of non-native food crops. And I think that, you know, as we move forward, there's going to be some of this hybrid of those two things, and even kind of looking at the possibilities of eating and relocalizing our food systems to include an enhancement of native food production in a relationship with the native people of this place. And in this case, you know, where I live, I'm on the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya people. So that's something that I would undertake in relationship with them, you know, and, you know, kind of fostering that longer term reparation-based relationship is something that I think is really important as well. So that is it. And yeah, feel free to check out my social media, my website, resiliencepermaculture.com. I'm around, I'm in Cottage Grove, so I'd love to see you in person someday when it's safe.
Well, thank you very much, Tal. I've been watching the chat and I'm not seeing questions. I wonder, and people didn't use the Q&A. so we can try this. If somebody has a question, Erica, is the best way, do you think, to ask them to raise their hand and we'll unmute them?
Yeah, we could try that, or they can type them into the chat.
Okay, so either, and we'll monitor, but if we've got questions.
I did see a hand raised earlier, but I'm not seeing it now.
Yeah, it went down. Madeline rose her hand, and I don't know if she now has a question she'd like to ask or raised her hand.
Oh, Pat Patterson.
Or should we also, we need to unmute people then?
Yeah, I have permission to give Pat permission to talk. So Pat,
Okay.
You're up. Trying.
Unmute now. And can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the things I've been extremely interested in is the fact that many plants that are non-native here are actually wild. We call them weeds, and they're highly nutritious and edible. One of the best ways to get even. There are also many native plants that are edible, but most people don't know them. So I think what you're doing, if there were more education in recognizing what is available in the system that you're living in, what is perhaps a problem in that system, just from the backyard perspective, just keep doing that. And I think we might get somewhere eventually.
Yeah, thank you. You're right. I mean, I didn't really get into that as much, but many invasives and weedy species are incredibly nutrient dense. I eat them quite frequently or use them medicinally and really appreciate them as I'm weeding them out of my garden beds and making room for other things.
Any other? Go ahead.
You know what, this is one of the responses is just, wow, such a change of perspective. And I think that that is really amazing, and it's a lot to think about, because how do we choose what point we want to restore to, and I guess not restore to, but try to move forward, you know, with all the concern about the Doug fir. I was thinking, well, is the climate that we'll have in the Willamette Valley actually going to be more conducive towards oak savannas? You know, as we anticipate going forward.
From what I've read, that is more like what we're going to be moving into, is hotter, drier, more like Umpqua Valley type characteristics. So looking at like even the black oak, which is native a little bit farther south, and some of the plant communities from, you know, the Klamath-Siskiyou range, you know, might be up for consideration for moving up here. So, but that's a big can of worms, shall we say. But I've talked to, I'm on the board of the Cerro Gordo Conservancy with botanists from the Army Corps of Engineers, and I know that they're having these same conversations, just like, you know, we're in the thick of it now, and we really need to be kind of expanding our conception of some of these things and taking action. So.
Yeah, well, and we've got a question that sort of follows up on that, because the question is, do you get a lot of pushback from stakeholders who are, you know, struggling to move away from our current economic agricultural paradigm?
What we've found, and with my business, most of what we do is we actually write a lot of forestry plans and restoration plans with the Oregon Department of Forestry and the Natural Resource Conservation Service. So we work a lot with different agencies. And most people are quite receptive to this. And, you know, just in my speaking and doing presentations, I've talked with many, many people in the restoration field and, you know, people who work for the Forest Service and different places who, for the most part, share these views and have kind of come to similar conclusions through their own careers and questioning, like, you know, I've had people come up to me and say, you know, I spent like 20 years spraying teasel at this, you know, for this state park where I worked, and I just got so done with it. I was like, what am I even doing? So I've had a lot of conversations like that, and I think that, you know, one of the issues, and I didn't really get into this, but many agencies really want to look at peer-reviewed research, and there's not as much available for these kind of alternative practices, largely because a lot of the kind of weed science graduate degrees and things like this are actually funded by the chemical industries. So rather than kind of posing these broad research questions of, oh, well, could we use, you know, rotationally grazed goats at this time interval for, you know, 3 years, they are saying, how much herbicide do we apply at this time? You know, that's their research project. So that's something, and I've talked to people who have actually worked within those departments, and, you know, getting some of that funding secured to create the peer-reviewed research that can then influence some of these agencies is something that, you know, there is work being done in that arena, but I would say that that could be pushed a little bit more to be creative about those kinds of things.
Well, a question that's kind of a follow-up on a lot of what you talked about, why invasives are there. We've got a question about invasives that actually can function as soil builders for disturbed sites. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, from my perspective, most of them are doing just that. And there is this interesting story that actually somebody told me after a presentation that I did, that I think sums this up nicely. So I'll try to just say it briefly. But basically, this woman came up to me and she said, you know, I bought 40 acres in 1970. She lived in Mendocino County, California. And she started a farm, kind of back to the land movement thing. And she had the back 10 acres, she just never really was able to get to. When she bought it, it was covered with Canada thistle. And she was like, I'm never going to be able to deal with that. So she just left it. 10 years in, Scotch broom started coming up through the Canada thistle. And she was like, oh God, you know. But she wasn't, again, she was busy on the farm. She never managed it, never mowed it, nothing. And she said, just in the past couple years, so this is like 40 years into owning this property, the Scotch broom individuals are starting to die. So the shrubs themselves, each one only lives 30 years or so. It's a short-lived species. And underneath, she's like, I was crawling around underneath there the other day. The soil is like the most rich black soil. It's like moist, shady, beautiful soil, like the best soil on the farm. And all of these seedlings of the native forest trees are germinating in the shade and restored soil underneath what was Canada thistle and Scotch broom for 40 years. And, you know, the Scotch broom itself is dying. You know, people say, oh, well, the seeds live for 90 years. Yes, but they only germinate where the soil conditions are right for them, which is not a really high nitrogen, high organic matter soil. They don't like the kinds of soil that they actually create over the long term. They're nitrogen fixing shrubs. So I find that very interesting. You know, I think for many of us, you know, working in our gardens and such, we don't want to just sit back and be like, okay, I'm going to wait 40 years for this soil to be repaired. But there are ways that I think we can kind of speed up that process and notice what these plants are telling us about a given site, and work with them to kind of speed up that soil development process. So one of the things that I've done quite a bit is, you know, and I've done this for like contract jobs too, like mowing Scotch broom at the peak of flower, like any nitrogen fixer. When you, like just with like a cover crop, when you mow it when it's in flower, that's when it has the most nodules on its roots. You pump all of that nitrogen into the soil, it dies back. If you do a follow-up mowing or, you know, a spot grazing with a ruminant, sheep or goats, to bring the sprouts back down, it's just going to continue that cycle until the plant eventually dies, and you're left with a more rehabilitated soil. You've gotten, you know, all the benefits of that green manure and literal manure. If you're using grazers, you can use it to build compost. There's lots of different ways that you can kind of use that material as you're working to build the soil in that spot. So there's a lot of interesting possibilities there, I would say.
That was great. Are there any other questions to get into the chat? I don't see any raised hands.
No, I'm not seeing, did we miss any?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, and I know we're about 10 or 15 minutes over.
So we'll let Tal get on with her day.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Tal. This has, or I'm sorry, Dow, it has been wonderful. And really appreciate your taking the time